Fluff decided to come here tonight to tell us all about the banking gnomes, right, Fluff? Banking gnomes are like cats. They don't like sharing anything, right? They just want to get petted and have lots of goodies and have a good time while doing minimal work. Well, Obama invited all the banking gnomes to the Oval Office the other day to chastise them about being unreasonable about their banking habits. And this is like telling a drunk he should stop drinking. Obviously, they're not going to do it. And indeed, they had a message for him. He better stop the rest of us from talking about them, and he better not talk about them in any way, shape, or form that's negative, that will reflect badly on them. He's supposed to support them in their wonderful enterprise. Here is a cartoon I did of it. Notice the terror and distress on the part of the gnome who wants to be bailed out, but also wants to control how he's bailed out and what the terms are, while Obama wants to restrain them, an impossible task. I have some interesting graphs showing how the banking community has expanded and their profits have risen tremendously compared to the rest of the economy, and how the workers who work for banks have gotten better pay over time, while the average worker has seen a decline in actual pay. We can see that from 1948 until 1978, the profitability of the banks was in a very narrow range, going up and down slightly, but starting in the 1980s, with the Reagan tax cuts, it took off. The wages of the financial workers, you can see, actually declined slightly after 1948, whereas the average worker saw their wages go up and up. But starting in 1978, they began to diverge, with the average worker's wages beginning to plummet versus inflation, while the compensation for bankers went up. Recently, Obama had an online town hall where he was asked questions about unemployment. And this is what he said. Not all of these jobs are going to come back, when asked about all the offshoring of U.S. jobs that used to be done here perfectly fine up until very recently. He felt that these jobs that were outsourced were poorly paid jobs, and that, of course, we wouldn't miss them. Jobs like building cars and doing computer programming and all these other objects that we used to make a lot of money doing here are done much cheaper overseas. Engineering jobs, many office jobs have been outsourced, telephone jobs. Reporters now are often overseas because then they can outsource that labor and have it appear hours earlier before the Americans get up. Everything is being outsourced, and I can't think of too many things that haven't been outsourced at this point. Maybe prostitution, but even that's outsourced. People go on tours to visit prostitutes in various exotic places. There's very few jobs that can't be ultimately outsourced in one way or another, or driven down in its wages by competition from overseas, especially if that competition is totally unrestricted, which is what free trade is all about. And I constantly talk about the dangers of free trade. It's not free. It's costing us a fortune. It costs us almost $1 trillion a year up until very recently, when our inability to buy anything has finally caused it to be reduced only somewhat. It's still a trade deficit. And when it comes to the list of all the nations for the amount of money they're losing in trade deficits, the United States tops the list. We are the worst. And obviously our president doesn't understand this correctly. He thinks that if we all get retrained, we'll get new jobs, and we'll all be happy forever after, and those jobs won't vanish like that. On the other hand, just the other hour, the gnomes who run banking schemes on pirate islands have threatened to move there permanently if we put on any controls on them or tax them in any way, shape, or form, because the G20 are talking about exactly that, taxing and controlling offshore banking. And of course, offshore banking flies under the radar along with all the other free trade things. They have to keep this going in order to have their free banking schemes, like their former carry trade business, which came out of Japan and came over here. That's where a lot of the money for the loans came from, for those easy to get house loans that were called ninja loans. You didn't have to give any real information. You could get lots of money because the money was coming practically for free from the pirates, who are very close to the gnomes who are visiting Obama in the White House to complain about us talking about them and restricting their business. This cartoon shows how the derivatives beast lives in a cave controlled by the Treasury, and how infinite money and the gnomes have released him so he could ravage the world. Just this week, the Chinese caused tremendous distress for the Americans because one Chinese official made a speech about replacing the dollar with a new world trade currency. And just even mentioning that caused the dollar to plummet very briefly by a good percentage. And this is just a shot across our prows because the Chinese, of course, will replace our currency because we have allowed our dollar to devalue too much, and we're pursuing the exact same zero interest rate regime the Japanese have implemented, and all other nations are being forced to follow us all the way down to zero. And 0% means no one makes any money on savings. It means that lending is at entirely the risk of the bank who is lending because there's no profit. How can you profit when everybody's running it at zero? The world has never had a zero banking system for very long because it's self-destructive. The Japanese system obviously is not working because the minute the Japanese carry trade terminated, Japan's export market collapsed. And this is why it's a weakness, not a strength. And the Chinese want to have a strong currency. They have lived with a very bad currency in the past. They have seen their currency devalued to utter worthlessness, not once or twice, but several historic times. In fact, they're the ones who invented paper money and the entire concept of a fiat currency, and also discovered the weaknesses of it nearly instantaneously, for no fiat currency can last longer than 50 years before it becomes utterly worthless, and that's if the government is careful. If a government is not careful, it loses value very rapidly, as we see in Zimbabwe. For some reason, Zimbabwe rarely makes the news in America. If you go online and you type in the word Zimbabwe, you will see one article after another about their inflation. But nearly all of these articles are from other countries. The U.S. is not looking at Zimbabwe because we are scared to see what lies there. Just like we don't want to look at the Weimar Republic, which tried to pay for World War I via inflation. We just decided to double the money we're spending on the war on terror, and we think this won't affect us, just like we decided to double the money that we're using to bail out the gnomes, who messed up everything in the first place. The Chinese are requesting that we control our gnomes, that we control our banking, and we control our trade. Of course, they would like it if we don't control trade. That's our problem, not theirs. But they know that if we continue on our present course, their dollar holdings will be worthless, and they don't want that either. They want us to be reasonable. Just like Obama said to the banking gnomes, I want you to be restrained and to control yourselves. This is like asking a cat not to jump up on the table and eat your dinner while you look the other way. Obviously, they're not going to control themselves unless there's also a threat of punishment. Namely, if they get slapped down regularly, they'll behave themselves. And of course, that's what I want to see happen. Arrest them all. And this is why I say all the time, arrest all these people because they wrecked the world's banking system. And if that isn't a crime, I don't know what is, except for, of course, our many war crimes. And we can't have that, can we? And here's Elaine Supkiss and Fluff saying good night and thank you for visiting us.